Welcome, weary traveler, to the echoes of the fallen realm, where epic tales become lullabies for the soul. Tonight, we climb the starlit peaks near Blackrock Mountain, following the young Paladin Turalyon as he keeps sacred vigil before destiny calls. Close your eyes and let the peaceful whispers of mountain wind and distant prayers guide you into dreams of eternal light and quiet courage. In the deep hours before dawn, when the world lay suspended between shadow and starlight, the mountains surrounding Blackrock loomed like sleeping giants against the velvet sky. These ancient peaks had stood sentinel over the land since the world's beginning, their stone faces weathered by countless seasons into expressions of patient wisdom that spoke of endurance beyond mortal understanding. Tonight, they watched over the Alliance forces that had made camp in the valleys below, their massive presence both protective and humbling to the small figures who dared to seek rest in their shadow. Among the scattered campfires that dotted the mountainside like earthbound stars, Turalyon knelt in prayer, his armor reflecting the gentle light of flames that flickered in the mountain breeze. The young Paladin had found a place apart from the main encampment, seeking solitude not from any desire to avoid his duties, but from the deeper need for communion with the light that burned within his heart like a constant flame. Here, surrounded by the eternal stillness of stone and sky, he could feel the presence of divine forces that existed beyond the immediate concerns of war and conquest. The air at this altitude was thin and cold, carrying with it the crystalline clarity that comes only at great heights where the atmosphere itself seems purified by proximity to the heavens. Each breath was like drinking starlight, filling his lungs with rarefied essence that seemed to nourish not just his body, but his spirit as well. The silence was profound and complete, broken only by the distant sound of wind singing through rocky crevices and the soft murmur of prayers being offered by other solitary figures scattered throughout the camp. Blackrock Mountain rose before them like a monument to some forgotten god, its peak shrouded in clouds that glowed faintly with reflected starlight. The mountain was ancient beyond reckoning, its volcanic heart having slept for so long the trees now grew upon its lower slopes and snow crowned its summit in winter splendor. Yet somewhere within its depths lay the fortress that had become the enemy's stronghold, a corruption of stone and fire that violated the natural majesty of the peak with purposes that spoke only of domination and control. But here, in this moment of quiet contemplation before the storm, there was only the peaceful rhythm of prayer and the gentle presence of the light that responded to every sincere call for guidance and strength. Turalyon's meditation carried him beyond the immediate concerns of the coming battle to deeper truths about the nature of faith and the burden of service that he had accepted when he first took the sacred oaths of the Silver Hand. The light that flowed through him was not his own, but belonged to something infinitely larger and more enduring than any individual consciousness. It was the accumulated compassion of every being who had ever sought to protect the innocent, the collective courage of all who had chosen to stand against darkness regardless of the personal cost. Through him, it reached out to touch the hearts and minds of everyone in the camp, offering comfort to the troubled and strength to the weary. Around him, the Alliance army slept with the profound exhaustion that comes only to those who have marched long distances across difficult terrain while carrying the weight of an entire civilization's hopes and fears. These were not just soldiers, but representatives of every aspect of human society: farmers and craftsmen, scholars and artists, young men barely old enough to bear arms, and grizzled veterans whose scars told stories of a dozen previous campaigns. Each sleeping figure represented a family somewhere in the Alliance lands, a circle of loved ones who waited for news that might never come or might bring word of loss too great to bear. Wives and children, parents and siblings, all the human connections that gave meaning to the abstract concepts of duty and honor that motivated these men to face death in service of causes larger than themselves. Turalyon could feel the weight of their trust and love like a physical presence, adding urgency to his prayers and depth to his commitment to the sacred mission that had brought them all to this remote mountain camp. The campfires scattered throughout the valley below burned with a warm orange glow that painted the sleeping soldiers' faces in shades of gold and amber, transforming even the most weathered features into something approaching art. Each fire was carefully tended by those assigned to the night watch, men who moved with quiet efficiency between the sleeping forms, checking on the wounded, adjusting blankets against the mountain cold, and maintaining the small rituals of care that kept an army functioning as a community rather than merely a collection of individual fighters. The flames themselves seemed to dance with unusual grace tonight, their movements creating patterns that might have been coincidence or might have been the visible manifestation of spiritual forces gathering their strength for the trial ahead. Some of the more sensitive souls among the camp followers claimed they could see faces in the fire, angels and saints offering silent blessing to those who served the cause of light, ancestors who had fought their own battles against darkness and now returned to inspire their descendants. Whether such visions were real or merely the products of minds stretched to their limits by stress and anticipation mattered little. What was important was the comfort they provided to men facing the possibility that the next sunrise might be their last, the reminder that they were part of a continuous tradition of service and sacrifice that stretched back through the generations to the very founding of their civilization. The horses that had carried the army to this remote place stood tethered in neat lines near the edge of the camp, their breath creating small clouds of vapor in the cold mountain air. These noble beasts had endured the hardships of the march with the same patient courage as their human companions, their loyalty and strength essential to the army's ability to function in terrain that would have defeated any force dependent on foot soldiers alone. Now they rested with the deep sleep of creatures who had given everything demanded of them and asked for nothing in return but food and shelter and the occasional gentle word from those they served. Their presence added another dimension to Turalyon's meditation as he considered the way that all creation seemed united in common purpose when called to serve the light, from the smallest insect to the greatest hero, each playing their assigned role in the vast symphony of existence. The supply wagons formed their own organized cluster near the center of the camp, their contents representing the accumulated labor and sacrifice of countless individuals who had contributed to the war effort without ever leaving their homes. Farmers who had donated grain from their harvest, smiths who had worked through the night to forge weapons and armor, women who had sewn banners and medical supplies, children who had given their pocket money to help fund the expedition. Each item in those wagons carried with it the prayers and hopes of ordinary people who understood that their own safety and freedom depended on the success of this remote campaign. Sacks of flour became communion bread, barrels of water became baptismal fonts, rolls of bandages became symbols of healing and renewal that would be needed to restore what war inevitably broke. The medical tents glowed softly with the light of carefully shielded lamps, where healers worked through the night to tend those who had been injured during the long march through hostile territory. These men and women represented the most sacred aspect of the Army's mission, the commitment to preserve life even in the midst of activities that inevitably led to death and destruction. Dr. Catherine Malorn, the expedition's chief physician, moved among her patients with a gentle competence that marked those who had devoted their lives to the healing arts. Her hands, soft despite years of hard work, carried the light's own blessing as she checked wounds and dispensed medications with the precision of long experience. She had trained in the cathedral hospitals of Stormwind, where the greatest medical minds of the age had taught her that healing was not just a matter of technique, but of faith. Faith in the body's ability to mend itself when properly supported. Faith in the spirit's capacity to triumph over physical suffering. Faith in the divine plan that made even apparently meaningless pain part of a larger pattern of growth and redemption. Her assistants, mostly young men and women who had volunteered for service despite having no military training, worked with the dedication of those who understood that they served a calling higher than mere profession. They had come from all walks of life, farm children who knew the healing properties of herbs, city dwellers whose education had included the study of anatomy and medicine, priests and priestesses whose faith gave them access to powers beyond normal human capability. Together, they formed a community within the larger community of the Army, bound together by their common commitment to the principle that life was sacred and must be preserved whenever possible. Their tent was a sanctuary where the normal rules of military hierarchy were suspended in favor of the more fundamental hierarchy that placed suffering souls at the center of all concern, regardless of rank or status. The chaplains moved through the camp like gentle spirits, offering whatever spiritual comfort their presence could provide to men facing the possibility that dawn might bring their final battle. Father Benedict Morrison, the senior chaplain, was a man whose long experience with the realities of war had deepened rather than diminished his faith, teaching him that the light's presence was most clearly visible in the darkest moments when human strength alone proved insufficient. He carried with him a collection of sacred objects that had been blessed by the highest authorities of the Church. A silver cross that had been touched by the Archbishop himself, a vial of water from the holy springs of Northshire Abbey, fragments of stone from the altar where the first Paladins had received their consecration. These were not mere symbols, but focal points for the faith that sustained the Army's spiritual cohesion, tangible reminders of the divine approval that sanctified their mission. As he moved from fire to fire, offering quiet words of encouragement and performing small rituals of blessing, Father Morrison felt the weight of the responsibility that had been placed upon his shoulders. These men looked to him not just for comfort, but for assurance that their cause was just, that their sacrifices would have meaning, that death in service of the light would lead to something better than mere extinction. His words were carefully chosen to acknowledge the reality of their situation while offering hope that transcended immediate circumstances. He spoke of the eternal nature of the struggle between light and darkness, of the way that individual acts of courage contributed to victories that might not be visible for generations, of the divine love that embraced all who served truth and justice, regardless of the outcome of any particular battle. Some soldiers knelt to receive his blessing, their heads bowed in attitudes of prayer that transformed them momentarily from warriors into pilgrims seeking divine guidance on a journey whose destination remained hidden in mystery. Others simply listened from their bedrolls, drawing what comfort they could from words that connected their immediate suffering to larger patterns of meaning and purpose. The night watch moved through the camp with practiced efficiency, their footsteps muffled by years of experience in the art of maintaining vigilance without disturbing those who needed rest. These were seasoned veterans, men whose ability to remain alert through the dangerous hours of darkness had been proven through numerous previous campaigns. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of professionals who understood the weight of the responsibility placed upon them. Captain Marcus Dane, the officer in charge of camp security, made his rounds with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through 20 years of military service. His eyes, trained to penetrate even the deepest shadows, constantly scanned the perimeter for any sign of movement that might indicate approaching danger. His hand rested casually on his sword hilt, ready to draw and give the alarm at the first indication of threat. But tonight the mountains seemed at peace, their ancient presence offering protection to the small human settlement that had temporarily disturbed their eternal solitude. The stars wheeled overhead in their appointed courses, marking the passage of time with the same reliable precision that had comforted travelers and soldiers since the beginning of the world. Their light was cold but reassuring, a reminder that some things remained constant even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. The wind that moved through the valley carried with it the sense of mountain flowers that bloomed only at high altitude, their delicate fragrances somehow managing to survive in conditions that would defeat more robust plants growing at sea level. These hardy blossoms had adapted to life in the thin air and intense cold by developing concentrated essences that could provide their full beauty in the brief growing season allowed by the harsh climate. Their perfume added a touch of unexpected sweetness to the night air, a reminder that beauty persisted even in the most unlikely places and circumstances. Some of the soldiers had gathered small bouquets of these alpine flowers to carry as tokens of hope, pressing them between the pages of prayer books or letters from home where their presence would serve as reminders of the world's inherent goodness. The mountain streams that flowed through the valley sang their ancient songs as they carried snowmelt down from the peaks toward distant lowlands, where the water would nourish farms and gardens and provide drinking water for cities whose inhabitants might never know the source of their sustenance. The sound was hypnotic and peaceful, a liquid lullaby that seemed designed by nature itself to promote rest and contemplation. Some of the soldiers had found places to sleep near the streams, drawn by the comforting sound of flowing water and the sense of cleanliness and renewal that moving water always provided. They slept more deeply there, their dreams filled with images of clear pools and mountain springs that offered healing and refreshment to anyone pure enough of heart to find them. The supply master, Quartermaster Thompson, made his final inventory check of the evening, ensuring that every item needed for the next day's operations was properly secured and accounted for. His ledgers contained the numerical representation of the Army's ability to continue functioning as an effective fighting force. So many pounds of grain, so many gallons of water, so many rounds of ammunition for the few firearms the Army possessed. But behind each number was a story of human dedication and sacrifice, of farmers who had donated from their own harvests, of craftsmen who had worked without pay to support the war effort, of families who had given their last savings to help equip the expedition. The quartermaster's careful accounting was a form of stewardship that honored the trust of all those who had contributed to the common cause. His work was unglamorous but essential, the kind of behind-the-scenes labor that kept armies fed and equipped, but rarely received recognition in the songs that celebrated military heroism. Yet, without his careful attention to detail, the most brilliant strategies and the most courageous fighters would be helpless, reduced to ineffectiveness by the simple lack of basic supplies. The armorer worked late into the night, making final adjustments to weapons and armor that would be tested in the crucible of battle when dawn came. Master craftsman Wilhelm Ironwright had spent 30 years perfecting his understanding of metallurgy and the art of creating implements that could preserve life by taking it efficiently. His hands, scarred by years of working with hot metal and sharp tools, moved with the precision of long experience as he checked every sword edge and armor joint for flaws that could prove fatal in combat. Each piece of equipment that passed through his hands received not just technical expertise, but something approaching love, the kind of care that craftsmen could only provide when they understood that their work would be used to protect people they valued. He knew many of the soldiers personally, had listened to their stories during the long march, had seen their photographs of wives and children, and heard their plans for after the war. Now, as he made final preparations for what might be their last battle, he invested each piece of metal with prayers for the safety of those who would carry it into combat. His workshop was both forge and chapel, a place where technical skill and spiritual devotion combined to create instruments that serve the cause of justice and protection of the innocent. The scouts who had been sent to observe enemy movements returned throughout the night with reports that painted a picture of the challenges that awaited the army when daylight came. These brave men and women had crept through hostile territory to gather intelligence about enemy numbers, positions, and capabilities, risking capture and death to provide information that might save the lives of their comrades. Their observations were methodically recorded and analyzed by the Army's intelligence officers, men whose job it was to transform scattered bits of information into coherent understanding of the tactical situation. Maps were updated, plans were revised, and contingency strategies were developed based on the latest intelligence about what lay ahead. But beneath the technical analysis lay deeper questions about the nature of the enemy they faced and the forces that drove them to such extremes of hostility and destruction. The scouts spoke of more than just military preparations. They described an atmosphere of corruption and malevolence that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the enemy stronghold, a spiritual pollution that affected even the weather patterns in the area. This was more than just another military campaign. It was a confrontation between fundamentally opposed worldviews, between those who believed in the possibility of growth and redemption, and those who served powers that recognized only domination and control. The physical battle that would be fought with swords and spells was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper struggle between forces that existed beyond the material world. As the night wore on and the stars continued their ancient dance across the heavens, Turalyon felt his prayers gradually expanding to encompass not just his immediate companions, but all who serve the light throughout the world. His meditation connected him to the vast network of faithful souls who shared his commitment to justice and protection of the innocent, creating a sense of unity that transcended the physical limitations of distance and circumstance. Through the light that flowed within him, he could sense the presence of paladins and priests in distant lands who were also keeping vigil this night, their prayers joining his in a chorus of spiritual energy that rose toward the divine source from which all blessing flowed. Together, they formed a community of faith that could not be defeated by any earthly power because it drew its strength from sources that existed beyond the reach of physical destruction. The sensation was both humbling and empowering, reminding him that he was part of something infinitely larger than his individual existence, while simultaneously affirming the unique importance of his personal contribution to the collective effort. Each prayer he offered, each act of faith he performed, each moment of doubt he overcame through trust in divine providence, added to the total spiritual energy available to those who fought for truth and justice. This understanding gave new depth to his sense of responsibility as he considered the men sleeping throughout the camp, many of whom would look to him for leadership and inspiration when the fighting began. He was not just a military officer, but a spiritual guide, called to embody in his own person the faith and courage that would sustain them all through the trial ahead. The light responded to his meditation by filling him with warmth and strength that seemed to emanate from every cell in his body, transforming him into a living beacon of hope that could inspire others simply through his presence. This was not power in the conventional sense, but rather the ability to serve as a conduit for divine energy that belonged to no individual, but was available to all who opened their hearts to receive it. As dawn approached with the inevitable certainty of natural law, the eastern horizon began to show the first faint blush of rose and gold that marked the boundary between night and day. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, as darkness slowly yielded to light in the eternal cycle that had repeated itself since the beginning of time and would continue long after all human conflicts had been resolved. The soldiers began to stir in their bedrolls, responding to some internal clock that told them their rest period was ending and the time for action was near. They rose with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had learned to transition quickly from sleep to full alertness, their movements economical and purposeful as they began the familiar rituals of preparation for battle. Weapons were checked one final time. Armor was adjusted for maximum protection and mobility, and personal effects were secured in ways that would keep them safe regardless of what the day might bring. Some men wrote final letters to their families, while others spent these precious moments in prayer or meditation, preparing their souls as carefully as they prepared their bodies for the test ahead. The cooks began preparing what might be the last meal many of these soldiers would ever eat, working with the same care and attention to detail they had shown throughout the campaign, despite the knowledge that their efforts might soon be rendered meaningless by the harsh realities of warfare. Hot food and warm drink had sustained the army's morale through many difficult days, and they would continue their vital work until the very end. Turalyon rose from his night-long vigil feeling refreshed despite his lack of sleep, the light's energy having sustained him through the long hours of prayer and meditation. His armor, which had seemed heavy when he first donned it for this campaign, now felt like a second skin that moved with him naturally as he prepared to take his place among the army's leaders. The sacred hammer that hung at his side seemed to pulse with inner fire, responding to the spiritual energy that flowed through him like a river of liquid light. This weapon was more than just a tool of war. It was a focal point for the divine power that he had been trained to channel in service of justice and protection of the innocent. As he looked out over the camp where hundreds of men prepared for what might be their final battle, Turalyon felt the weight of command settling upon his shoulders like a familiar cloak. These soldiers had placed their trust in him, and he would not fail them if courage and faith could prevent it. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together with the strength that came from unity of purpose and commitment to ideals worth any sacrifice. The mountain peaks that surrounded them caught the first rays of dawn and threw them back in brilliant displays of reflected light that painted the sky in colors that had no names in mortal languages. This was the daily miracle that reminded all observers that beauty persisted even in the darkest times, that creation continued its eternal work of renewal regardless of the temporary setbacks that human conflicts might create. In that light, Turalyon saw reflected all the hopes and dreams that had motivated these men to leave their homes and families in service of a cause larger than themselves. They fought not for glory or conquest, but for the preservation of values and principles that made life worth living, for the protection of those who could not protect themselves, for the eternal promise that good would ultimately triumph over evil if people of faith were willing to pay the price that victory demanded. The light within him blazed brighter as the sun climbed higher, filling him with the certainty that whatever happened in the hours ahead, their cause was just, and their efforts would not be in vain. The battle they were about to fight would be remembered not just as a military engagement, but as a moment when ordinary people rose to extraordinary heights in service of ideals that transcended the immediate concerns of survival and conquest. As the army prepared for its final advance toward the enemy stronghold, Turalyon offered one last prayer for the souls under his command and for the success of their mission. The light that answered his call was warm and bright and eternal, a reminder that some things endured beyond the reach of any earthly power, and that those who served truth and justice were never truly alone in their struggles. But before the final march could begin, before contemplation gave way to action and prayer transformed into deed, there remained one last ritual that the sacred tradition of the Silver Hand demanded of its champions. Deep within the highest reaches of the mountain camp, where the air grew so thin that each breath became a conscious act of communion with the divine, there stood an ancient shrine that had been carved from living rock by pilgrims whose names were lost to history, but whose faith had endured across the centuries. This shrine was not marked on any map nor mentioned in any military intelligence report, yet every paladin who had ever served in these mountains had somehow found their way to it when the hour of greatest trial approached. It was said that the shrine existed in a place where the boundary between the earthly and celestial realms grew thin, allowing mortal souls to touch the infinite source from which all blessing flowed. Turalyon felt himself drawn to this sacred place not by conscious decision, but by an irresistible compulsion that seemed to originate from the very core of his being. The path that led to the shrine was treacherous, winding through crevices and across ledges that would challenge even the most experienced mountain climber. Yet his feet found their way with the certainty of long familiarity, despite his never having walked this route before. The journey upward through the pre-dawn darkness felt like ascending through layers of reality itself, each step taking him further from the concerns of the material world and deeper into realms where the normal laws of cause and effect operated according to principles that transcended ordinary understanding. The very air grew more luminous as he climbed, until breathing became an act of absorbing liquid starlight that nourished not just his lungs, but his soul. The shrine, when he finally reached it, was a marvel of ancient craftsmanship that seemed to have been created not by human hands, but by some divine architect who understood the mathematical principles underlying the harmony of the spheres. The stone itself glowed with inner light that had nothing to do with any earthly source, emanating a warmth that penetrated to the very marrow of his bones and filled him with peace beyond all understanding. Here, in this place of power that existed beyond time and space, Turalyon knelt in prayer as countless paladins had done before him, adding his voice to a chorus of supplication that had been rising toward heaven for over 1,000 years. The stones around him seemed to resonate with the accumulated faith of all those previous pilgrims, creating harmonics that transformed his individual prayers into part of a vast symphony of devotion that spanned the centuries. The light that responded to his call was unlike anything he had ever experienced before, not merely the familiar warmth and strength that had sustained him through his training, but something infinitely more vast and powerful. this was the pure essence of divine love itself, unfiltered by any earthly consideration or limitation, flowing into him with such intensity that he felt his individual consciousness beginning to merge with something cosmic in scope and eternal in duration. Through this expanded awareness, Turalyon began to perceive the true nature of the conflict that had brought him to this remote mountain shrine. What appeared to mortal eyes as merely another war between competing armies was revealed to be part of a cosmic struggle between forces of creation and destruction that had been playing out across the universe since the beginning of time itself. The enemy that awaited them in the stronghold below was not just another collection of hostile warriors, but the local manifestation of a principle that sought to reduce all existence to sterile uniformity, to eliminate the divine spark of creativity and growth that made life worth preserving. They served powers that viewed consciousness itself as an aberration to be corrected, beauty as a weakness to be eliminated, love as a tactical disadvantage to be exploited. Against such forces, conventional military tactics would prove insufficient. Victory would require not just superior strategy and equipment, but a level of spiritual purity that could resist corruption even under the most extreme conditions. The battle ahead would be fought simultaneously on multiple levels of reality, with the outcome determined as much by faith and courage as by sword and spell. As this understanding flowed through him, Turalyon felt himself being prepared for a role that no individual paladin had ever been asked to fulfill before. He was being transformed into a living conduit for divine energy, a focal point through which the accumulated faith of an entire army could be channeled into specific actions that would tip the balance between light and darkness, hope and despair, creation and destruction. The transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying as he felt his individual identity beginning to expand beyond the normal boundaries of mortal consciousness. He remained himself while simultaneously becoming something infinitely larger, retaining his human perspective while gaining access to cosmic forces that operated according to principles no single mind could fully comprehend. Through him, the light itself would participate in the coming battle, lending its infinite wisdom and power to the defense of everything that made existence meaningful and beautiful. The enemy would face not just the military might of the Alliance forces, but the combined spiritual energy of every soul throughout the universe who had ever chosen love over hate, creation over destruction, hope over despair. The shrine's ancient stones began to pulse with visible energy as the transformation reached its climax, their crystalline structure serving as a lens that focused and amplified the divine power flowing through Turalyon until it became visible to anyone with the sensitivity to perceive it. He was becoming a living beacon of hope that would shine like a star in the darkness, inspiring his comrades and striking fear into the hearts of those who served powers antithetical to life itself. But even as he felt himself being elevated to heights of spiritual awareness that few mortals had ever achieved, Turalyon never lost sight of the fundamental humility that lay at the heart of true service. This power was not his own, but belonged to the source from which all existence flowed, and he was merely the vessel chosen to carry it into the world where it was needed most urgently. As the first rays of dawn began to penetrate the thin air surrounding the mountain shrine, Turalyon felt the final phase of his preparation beginning. The light that filled him was no longer just a source of personal strength, but had become a living presence that would guide his every action, ensuring that each decision he made would serve the highest good, regardless of the immediate consequences to himself or others. The sacred hammer that hung at his side began to glow with the same inner radiance that now emanated from his own form, the weapon transforming from a mere tool of war into an instrument of divine justice that could channel forces beyond the reach of any earthly power. When the time came to use it, the hammer would strike not just with the strength of mortal muscle, but with the accumulated authority of every righteous cause that had ever been defended by those who served the light. As he began his descent from the shrine back to the camp where his army awaited his return, Turalyon carried with him the certainty that whatever trials lay ahead, they would be faced with resources that transcended ordinary human capability. The men under his command would fight not just as individual warriors, but as instruments of a divine will that had been working since the beginning of time to bring order from chaos, beauty from ugliness, love from hatred. The path down the mountain seemed transformed by his passage, as if the very stones were responding to the presence of the divine energy that flowed through him. Flowers bloomed out of season in crevices where no plant should have been able to survive, while springs of clear water bubbled up from rocks that had been dry for centuries. Even the mountain itself seemed to be preparing for the role it would play in the cosmic drama about to unfold. When Turalyon reached the camp, he found his soldiers already assembled in formation, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and solemnity that marked men who understood the magnitude of the task before them. But as he walked among them, something extraordinary began to happen. The light that burned within him began to spread to those around him, filling them with courage and strength beyond their normal capabilities. Veterans who had lived through countless battles felt their hands grow steady and their hearts fill with unshakable confidence, while young soldiers who had never faced combat found themselves inspired by visions of victory that transcended any possibility of personal defeat. This was not mere emotional manipulation, but the genuine transfer of spiritual energy from a source that could never be exhausted because it drew its power from the infinite well of divine love. The transformation spread throughout the entire army like ripples on a pond as soldier after soldier found himself touched by the presence of something sacred and eternal. Their weapons seemed to grow lighter in their hands, while their armor provided protection that went beyond mere physical coverage. They were being prepared not just for battle, but for participation in a cosmic event that would determine the future direction of reality itself. Lord Anduin Lothar, the army's supreme commander, felt the change immediately as Turalyon approached the command position where the final briefing was to be conducted. The grizzled warrior had led men into battle more times than he could count, but he had never experienced anything like the atmosphere that now surrounded his forces. This was more than improved morale. It was the tangible presence of divine blessing that transformed ordinary soldiers into instruments of celestial justice. The battle plans that had been developed through careful intelligence gathering and strategic analysis suddenly seemed almost superfluous, as if the outcome had already been determined by forces operating on levels far beyond tactical considerations. Yet the plans remained important as expressions of human will and determination, physical manifestations of the spiritual commitment that had made this divine intervention possible. As the army began its advance toward the enemy stronghold, the very landscape seemed to transform around them. Paths that had been treacherous became smooth and easily navigable, while streams that had run muddy and polluted cleared to crystal purity at their approach. The mountain itself appeared to be offering its assistance to those who served the cause of light, providing natural advantages that no amount of human engineering could have achieved. The enemy scouts who observed this advance found themselves confused and disoriented, their reports to their commanders making little sense to minds that could not comprehend the possibility of divine intervention in earthly affairs. They spoke of Alliance soldiers who moved with impossible coordination, of terrain that shifted to favor their enemies, of an atmosphere of power and purpose that struck fear into hearts that had never known doubt. But the corruption that served as the enemy's source of strength was not easily defeated, and as the Alliance forces drew nearer to their objective, they began to encounter resistance that went beyond mere military opposition. The very air around the enemy stronghold was thick with malevolent energy that sought to poison the thoughts and weaken the resolve of any who approached with hostile intent. This spiritual pollution was the accumulated result of countless atrocities committed in service of powers that fed on suffering and despair, building up over time into a miasma of evil that could corrupt even the purest soul if given sufficient exposure. Against ordinary warriors, it would have proven an insurmountable barrier, turning them against each other, or driving them to madness before they could reach their objective. But the light that flowed through Turalyon and had spread throughout his army created a protective barrier that no amount of spiritual corruption could penetrate. Where the two forces met, there was a visible boundary between regions of light and darkness, hope and despair, creation and destruction. The very landscape bore witness to this cosmic confrontation, with flowers wilting on one side of the line while blooming with supernatural vitality on the other. The final assault, when it began, was unlike any battle that had ever been fought in the history of the world. This was not just a conflict between opposing armies, but a direct confrontation between the fundamental principles that governed existence itself. Each sword stroke and spell carried metaphysical significance that rippled outward through dimensions that existed beyond physical space, while every act of courage or cowardice contributed to outcomes that would influence the development of consciousness throughout the galaxy. Turalyon fought at the center of the storm, his hammer blazing with divine fire as he carved a path through enemy ranks that seemed to melt away before the purity of his purpose. But his true power lay not in his ability to destroy, but in his capacity to inspire, his very presence serving as a beacon of hope that reminded every Alliance warrior of the values and principles for which they fought. The light that flowed through him was not his own, but belonged to every soul that had ever chosen to serve truth and justice over personal advantage, every heart that had ever opened itself to divine love, every mind that had ever recognized the sacred nature of existence itself. Through him, all those accumulated choices and commitments found expression in actions that could reshape reality according to the highest ideals of conscious evolution. As the battle reached its climax and the enemy's stronghold began to crumble under the combined assault of physical and spiritual forces, Turalyon felt himself lifted beyond all personal concerns to a perspective that encompassed the cosmic significance of what was being accomplished. This victory was more than just another military success. It was a fundamental triumph of the principles that made existence meaningful over those that sought to reduce everything to sterile uniformity. The fortress walls that had stood for centuries as monuments to the power of corruption and domination were being revealed as nothing more than illusions, impressive to limited perception, but insubstantial when confronted by the reality of divine truth. The enemy warriors who had seemed so formidable in their alien armor and weapons were shown to be hollow shells, empty vessels for powers that had no real substance when faced with genuine spiritual authority. Yet even in victory, Turalyon maintained the humility that mark true servants of the light, understanding that he had been merely the instrument through which forces greater than himself had chosen to work. The triumph belonged not to him or even to his army, but to the eternal principles of love and justice that had found expression through their willingness to serve causes larger than personal survival or advancement. As the last remnants of enemy resistance collapsed and the stronghold was secured, a profound silence settled over the battlefield. Not the silence of death and destruction, but the peace that comes when harmony is restored to places where discord had reigned supreme. The mountain itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its ancient stone finally freed from the spiritual pollution that had contaminated it for so long. The soldiers who had participated in this cosmic battle found themselves transformed by the experience, marked forever by their exposure to forces that existed beyond the normal range of mortal perception. They had seen the face of ultimate reality and had played their part in defending it against powers that sought its annihilation, an experience that would influence every subsequent moment of their lives. In the aftermath of victory, as the army began the work of establishing order and beginning the long process of healing that would be required to repair the damage done by years of corruption, Turalyon felt the divine presence that had flowed through him beginning to recede to more sustainable levels. He remained changed by the experience, forever marked as one who had served as a conduit for cosmic forces, but he was also returned to the humble state of consciousness that would allow him to function effectively in the ordinary world. The light continued to burn within him as it always had and always would, but now it burned with the deep, steady flame of mature faith rather than the blazing intensity of divine intervention. He had been granted a glimpse of ultimate reality and had proven himself worthy of the trust placed in him. But now he must return to the patient work of daily service that was the true measure of a paladin's dedication. As the sun climbed toward its zenith and the mountain air filled with the sounds of celebration and reconstruction, Turalyon offered a prayer of gratitude for the privilege of having served as an instrument of divine will. The battle had been won, the enemy defeated, and the cosmic balance restored, but the war between light and darkness would continue as long as consciousness existed in the universe. His role in that eternal struggle would be to maintain the flame of hope that had burned so brightly during this moment of crisis, ensuring that it remained available to future generations who would face their own trials and challenges. The light that had flowed through him had not diminished, but had multiplied, spreading to every soul that had been touched by its presence and creating a network of spiritual energy that would endure long after the specific circumstances of this battle had been forgotten. The mountains that surrounded them bore witness to this triumph with their eternal patience, their peaks catching the morning light and reflecting it back to the heavens in displays of natural beauty that reminded all observers that creation continued its work of bringing order from chaos, meaning from confusion, hope from despair. In the camp where soldiers rested and healers tended the wounded, there was talk of home and the families that waited for news of their loved ones' fate. Letters were written and preparations made for the long journey back to the civilized lands, where normal life continued its patient course, sustained by the sacrifices of those who were willing to venture into darkness so that others might live in light. But beneath the immediate concerns of logistics and administration, there was a deeper understanding that something fundamental had been accomplished here, something that transcended the specific military objectives that had brought them to this remote mountain stronghold. They had participated in a cosmic drama that connected their individual actions to the ultimate destiny of consciousness itself, proving that ordinary mortals could serve as instruments of divine will when they surrendered their personal agenda to the service of truth and justice. The memory of this experience would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead, reminding them that they were part of a story infinitely larger than any individual existence, participants in an eternal struggle that gave meaning and purpose to every moment of their lives. As the afternoon wore on and preparations for departure continued, Turalyon found himself drawn once more to the high places where he had received his sacred commission. The shrine that had been the site of his transformation was gone, dissolved back into the living rock from which it had emerged. But the memory of what had transpired there would remain with him forever. He understood now that such experiences were not meant to be permanent fixtures, but rather moments of revelation that prepared chosen individuals for the work they must do in the ordinary world. The true test of his worthiness lay not in his ability to maintain constant contact with cosmic forces, but in his capacity to carry the insights gained from such encounters back into the daily routine of service and sacrifice that marked the life of every true Paladin. The light that burned within him would continue to provide guidance and strength for whatever trials awaited, but it would do so through the accumulated wisdom of experience rather than the overwhelming intensity of direct divine intervention. He had been shown the ultimate destination toward which all conscious evolution was moving, but now he must walk the patient path that would eventually lead others to the same glorious understanding. The scene fades slowly into the peaceful light of mountain afternoon, carrying the listener gently toward dreams where peaks touch heaven and prayers become stars, where courage burns eternal in hearts that serve the light, and where the ancient promise that faith conquers all echoes through valleys of gold and summits of crystal. But the echoes of that cosmic victory would ripple outward through dimensions beyond the physical, touching every corner of creation where the eternal struggle between light and darkness played out its ancient drama. In distant lands, other champions of the light felt the change as a warming of their hearts and a strengthening of their resolve, while in the deepest sanctuaries of evil, servants of corruption trembled at the sudden diminishment of their power. The mountain itself had been transformed by the events that had taken place within its ancient embrace, its stones purified of the spiritual pollution that had accumulated over years of enemy occupation. Where once the very air had been thick with malevolent energy, now breezes carried fragrances of wildflowers and mountain springs, the sense of renewal and regeneration that marked places where the natural order had been restored to its proper harmony. The streams that flowed down from the peaks ran clearer than they had for decades, their waters carrying healing properties that would benefit every living thing they touched on their journey toward distant valleys and plains. Fish that had been absent from these waters for years began to return, drawn by the purity that now characterized every aspect of the mountain's ecosystem. Birds whose songs had been silenced by the presence of corruption began to return to their ancestral nesting grounds, filling the air with melodies that spoke of joy and freedom regained. Their music served as a natural symphony that celebrated the triumph of life over death, beauty over ugliness, hope over despair. Even the insects that buzzed among the alpine flowers seemed to move with renewed purpose and vitality. The soldiers who had participated in this cosmic drama found themselves changed in ways that would influence every subsequent moment of their lives. They had looked upon the face of ultimate reality and had played their part in defending it against forces that sought its annihilation, an experience that marked them forever as witnesses to the truth that lay behind all appearances. Some spoke in hushed tones of visions they had seen during the heat of battle, angels walking among the ranks, departed comrades returning to fight alongside them one last time, glimpses of the divine plan that connected every individual action to outcomes of cosmic significance. Whether these visions were literally true or metaphorical representations of deeper truths mattered less than their effect on the souls of those who experienced them. The wounded found their injuries healing with miraculous speed, while those who had suffered spiritual trauma from exposure to corrupting influences discovered their faith restored and their hope renewed. The very atmosphere of the camp had become a sanctuary where healing occurred on multiple levels simultaneously, addressing not just physical damage, but the deeper wounds that warfare inevitably inflicted on the human spirit. Dr. Catherine Malorne worked among her patients with hands that seemed to channel healing energy directly from the source of all restoration, her medical skills enhanced by access to powers that transcended ordinary therapeutic techniques. She found wounds closing with minimal scarring, infections clearing without the need for extensive treatment, and psychological trauma healing as patients were able to integrate their experiences into larger patterns of meaning and purpose. Her medical tent became a place of pilgrimage for soldiers throughout the camp, not because they were physically injured, but because they sought to understand the significance of what they had experienced and to ensure that the memories of their spiritual encounter would remain vivid and transformative throughout their lives. Father Benedict Morrison found himself overwhelmed by requests for private consultation as men struggled to process experiences that challenged every assumption they had previously held about the nature of reality and their place within it. His chapel tent was filled day and night with soldiers seeking guidance on how to integrate cosmic awareness into the practical demands of daily existence. The chaplain spoke of the responsibility that came with having been granted such profound insights, the obligation to serve as bridges between the ordinary world of material concerns and the ultimate realm of spiritual truth that they had glimpsed during the battle. They were now carriers of sacred knowledge that could transform others simply through the authenticity of their witness and the depth of their commitment to the principles they had seen validated in cosmic combat. As word of the victory spread to other alliance forces and eventually to the kingdoms from which these soldiers had come, the story grew in the telling until it became legend, then myth, then the foundation for an entirely new understanding of the relationship between human effort and divine intervention. Bards would sing of the battle for generations, their songs carrying forward the essential truth that ordinary mortals could serve as instruments of cosmic justice when they aligned their will with the purposes of creation itself. But for those who had actually participated in these events, the true significance lay not in the dramatic narrative that would capture popular imagination, but in the quiet certainty that their lives had been permanently aligned with forces greater than themselves. They had discovered that the universe itself was conscious and purposeful, that individual actions mattered in ways they had never imagined, and that the apparent chaos and suffering of existence were part of a larger pattern that was ultimately meaningful and just. This knowledge would sustain them through whatever challenges awaited in the years ahead, providing an anchor of certainty in times of doubt and a source of strength when purely human resources proved insufficient. They had become living testimonies to the truth that faith was not mere wishful thinking, but accurate perception of the deepest structures of reality. The journey home, when it began several days later, was transformed from a mere military movement into something approaching a pilgrimage, as soldiers who had been marked by cosmic forces carried their transformed consciousness back into a world that desperately needed the hope and wisdom they had gained. They moved with a peace and purpose that was visible to everyone they encountered, inspiring questions and conversations that would plant seeds of spiritual renewal in countless hearts. Villages that had been preparing for the worst, expecting news of defeat and the approach of enemy forces, found themselves instead welcoming heroes who brought word of victory achieved through means that transcended ordinary military capability. The story they told was one that restored faith in the ultimate justice of existence, the possibility that good could triumph over evil when supported by divine intervention, the reality that prayer and sacrifice could literally reshape the fabric of reality itself. Children who heard these tales would carry them into adulthood as foundational truths that would influence every major decision of their lives, while artists and poets would find in them inspiration for works that would preserve and transmit the essential insights across generations and cultures. The victory at Blackrock had created ripples that would spread through time as well as space, touching souls that would not be born for centuries to come. In the royal courts of the Alliance kingdoms, the news was received with a mixture of relief and wonder that challenged the carefully maintained distinction between political and spiritual authority. Kings and ministers who had based their policies on purely material calculations found themselves confronting evidence that ultimate power belonged to forces that operated according to principles of justice rather than mere strength or cunning. Some rulers embraced this revelation as confirmation of their own divine mandate, while others found it deeply disturbing to their sense of autonomous authority. But all were forced to reckon with the implications of a universe in which moral choices had consequences that transcended the immediate political sphere and connected individual actions to cosmic outcomes. The scholars and theologians who studied these events for years afterward would debate their exact significance and implications, but they could not deny the fundamental fact that something unprecedented had occurred, something that challenged every conventional understanding of the relationship between earth and heaven, time and eternity, human effort and divine will. Turalyon himself found that his return to normal consciousness was gradual and sometimes difficult as he learned to function effectively without the constant presence of overwhelming divine energy that had sustained him during the cosmic battle. The light continued to burn within him, but now it required careful tending and conscious cooperation rather than the effortless flow that had characterized his transformed state. This adjustment was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his entire experience, as he had to learn to trust in divine guidance that came through subtle intuition and accumulated wisdom rather than direct revelation and miraculous intervention. The path of faithful service that lay ahead would test his character in ways that cosmic battle never could, requiring patience and humility that were far more difficult to maintain than courage and strength. But he was not alone in this adjustment, as every member of his army faced similar challenges in integrating their extraordinary experience into the ordinary routines of peacetime existence. They formed a community of shared understanding that would support each other through the years ahead, bound together by memories that could never be adequately communicated to those who had not shared them. The weapons and armor that had been blessed during the cosmic battle retained some measure of their enhanced properties, serving as tangible reminders of the spiritual forces that had worked through material objects to achieve outcomes that transcended normal physical limitations. These items became treasured heirlooms that would be passed down through generations, carrying with them not just sentimental value, but actual spiritual power that could provide protection and guidance to their bearers. The mountain itself became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking spiritual renewal and divine guidance. As word spread of the miraculous events that had taken place there, the ancient shrine that had served as the focal point for Turalyon's transformation would reappear from time to time, manifesting to those whose need for divine encounter was matched by their readiness to receive such blessing. These pilgrimages became an established tradition that would endure for centuries, with each generation of seekers adding their own prayers and offerings to the accumulated spiritual energy that made the mountain a place where heaven and earth touched with unusual intimacy. The stories told around the campfires of successive pilgrims would preserve and transmit the essential truths that had been revealed during the cosmic battle, ensuring that the insights gained through divine intervention would remain available to future generations. Yet even as the immediate effects of the victory began to spread through space and time, influencing countless lives and decisions across multiple realms and dimensions, the deeper significance of what had been accomplished could only be fully appreciated from the cosmic perspective that transcended all earthly concerns and considerations. From that ultimate viewpoint, the battle at Blackrock represented just one moment in an eternal struggle between forces of creation and destruction that played out simultaneously on countless worlds throughout the universe. But it was a significant moment nonetheless, a time when the balance had been definitively tipped in favor of consciousness and growth, beauty and meaning, love and justice. The victory had established a new precedent for divine intervention in earthly affairs, demonstrating that the cosmic forces of good were not passive observers, but active participants in the struggle for the soul of creation. This knowledge would inspire champions of light throughout the galaxy to greater efforts and more complete commitment to the principles that made existence meaningful. But perhaps most importantly, the events at Blackrock had proven that ordinary mortals could indeed serve as effective instruments of divine will when they surrendered their personal agenda to the service of truth and justice. This revelation opened possibilities for conscious evolution that had never existed before, suggesting that the ultimate destiny of aware beings might be far more glorious than anyone had previously dared to imagine. The mountain peaks that had witnessed this cosmic drama continued their eternal watch over the valleys below, their snow-capped summits catching and reflecting the light of distant stars in patterns that seemed to spell out messages of hope and encouragement to any who possessed the sensitivity to read them. They had become more than mere geological formations, transformed into monuments to the triumph of spirit over matter, faith over doubt, love over fear. In the years that would follow, poets and mystics would climb these peaks, seeking inspiration for works that might capture something of the cosmic significance that had been revealed there. Some would receive visions and insights that would influence the spiritual development of entire cultures, while others would simply find the peace and renewal that came from contact with places where the divine presence had manifested with unusual clarity and power. The streams that carried mountain water down to distant valleys would nourish crops and communities with liquid that had been blessed by its contact with sacred stone, spreading the influence of the cosmic victory far beyond the immediate geographical area where it had occurred. The very soil that received this water would become more fertile, the plants that grew in it more vital, the animals that fed on them healthier and more robust. This was the way that divine blessing worked in the world, not through dramatic gestures that commanded universal attention, but through subtle influences that gradually transformed everything they touched, spreading from soul to soul and heart to heart until entire civilizations were elevated to new levels of consciousness and capability. The light that had shone so brightly during the cosmic battle continued to burn with steady warmth in the hearts of all who had been touched by it, serving as an eternal flame that could kindle similar light in others who were ready to receive it. This was the true victory that had been won at Blackrock, not the defeat of a particular enemy, but the establishment of a source of spiritual energy that would never be extinguished as long as conscious beings existed who were willing to serve the cause of truth and justice. But even as the immediate aftermath of victory settled into the gentler rhythms of recovery and reflection, deeper currents of change were already beginning to flow through the fabric of reality itself. The cosmic battle had torn open channels between dimensions that had been sealed for eons, allowing energies and influences to move between realms that had been isolated from each other since the beginning of time. Through these newly opened pathways, beings of light and wisdom began to make contact with the mortal realm, drawn by the spiritual beacon that had been established at Blackrock. These were not the crude interventions of lesser entities seeking worship or manipulation, but the subtle guidance of cosmic intelligences whose only desire was to assist in the ongoing evolution of consciousness wherever it might be found. Turalyon began to receive visitations during his meditations, not as dramatic apparitions that commanded attention, but as gentle presences that offered insights and understanding that expanded his comprehension of the cosmic forces he had helped to channel. These teachers spoke without words, communicating directly through the transmission of pure knowledge that bypassed the limitations of language and cultural conditioning. Through these encounters, he learned that the events at Blackrock were part of a much larger pattern of awakening that was occurring simultaneously throughout the galaxy as planets and civilizations that had been dormant for millennia began to remember their connection to the source of all existence. The victory they had won was not an isolated event, but one note in a vast symphony of spiritual renaissance that was transforming the universe itself. This understanding brought with it both profound humility and awesome responsibility, as Turalyon realized that he and his companions had become part of a cosmic network of awakened beings whose task was to serve as bridges between the earthly and celestial realms. They were no longer merely soldiers or even paladins, but had become priests of a new dispensation that would reshape the relationship between matter and spirit throughout creation. The other members of his army were experiencing similar expansions of awareness, each according to their individual nature and capacity for spiritual growth. Some found themselves developing abilities that transcended normal human limitations, healers whose touch could cure diseases that had been thought incurable, warriors whose presence on the battlefield inspired courage in allies while striking terror into the hearts of their enemies, scholars whose insights bridged the gap between mundane knowledge and cosmic wisdom. But perhaps more importantly, all of them had gained access to a level of certainty about the ultimate meaning and purpose of existence that no amount of philosophical speculation could have provided. They had seen the cosmic machinery of justice in operation and understood viscerally that every action, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, contributed to outcomes that rippled outward through space and time to influence the destiny of countless souls. This knowledge transformed their approach to even the most mundane activities of daily life, as they recognized that preparing a meal, maintaining equipment, or offering comfort to a comrade were all forms of sacred service that participated in the ongoing work of creation. Nothing was merely secular. Everything had spiritual significance when performed with conscious awareness of its connection to the cosmic whole. The camp that had served as their base during the assault on Blackrock began to transform into something resembling a monastery or spiritual retreat center. As soldiers who might have spent their leisure time in gambling or idle conversation instead gathered for prayer and meditation. The atmosphere became one of quiet contemplation and mutual support as each individual worked to integrate their extraordinary experience into a sustainable pattern of spiritual practice. The evening prayer services that Father Morrison conducted grew in attendance and intensity as men who had previously been indifferent to religious observance found themselves drawn by an inner hunger that could only be satisfied through communion with the divine source that they had encountered during the battle. These gatherings became opportunities for sharing insights and experiences that helped everyone process the magnitude of what had occurred. But the changes were not limited to formal religious activities, as the entire rhythm of camp life began to reflect the deeper harmony that the soldiers had discovered within themselves. Arguments and conflicts that had previously disrupted unit cohesion simply ceased to occur, not through external discipline, but because the men had gained access to a perspective that transcended the petty concerns that usually generated interpersonal friction. Work details that had once been seen as tedious chores were approached with the same careful attention that might be given to sacred rituals, as the soldiers recognized that every task was an opportunity to express their gratitude for the privilege of serving the light. The camp became a place where the ordinary activities of military life were elevated to the status of spiritual practices. This transformation extended beyond the immediate confines of the army to influence every aspect of their interaction with the local environment. The mountain streams ran clearer because the soldiers were conscious of their impact on the ecosystem, while the wildlife in the area grew more abundant and diverse as the spiritual energy emanating from the camp created conditions that supported life in all its forms. Flowers bloomed out of season in response to the presence of beings who had been touched by cosmic forces, while trees that had been stunted by years of spiritual pollution began to grow with renewed vigor. The very air seemed cleaner and more vital, charged with energies that promoted health and vitality in everything they touched. Local inhabitants who had fled the area during the enemy occupation began to return, drawn by reports of the miraculous changes that had occurred since the Alliance victory. They found not just a restored landscape, but an atmosphere of peace and blessing that seemed to permeate every aspect of the region. Many chose to remain in the vicinity, establishing communities dedicated to preserving and transmitting the spiritual insights that had been revealed through the cosmic battle. These new settlements became centers of learning and spiritual practice, where the wisdom gained at Blackrock could be studied and applied to the challenges of daily life. Scholars and mystics from distant lands began to make pilgrimages to these communities, seeking to understand the principles that had made such profound transformation possible. The knowledge they gained was not kept secret, but was freely shared with any who demonstrated genuine commitment to the path of spiritual service. This openness created a network of awakened communities that spread gradually throughout the Alliance territories and beyond, carrying the influence of the cosmic victory into realms that had never heard of Blackrock but desperately needed the hope and healing that such knowledge could provide. Kings and nobles who had previously ruled through fear and manipulation found their authority challenged not by rebellion or revolution, but by the simple presence of subjects who had gained access to sources of meaning and purpose that transcended any earthly hierarchy. The very foundation of political power began to shift as more people discovered that true authority came from alignment with cosmic principles rather than from the accumulation of material resources or the application of force. This transformation was gradual and largely peaceful, as the awakened consciousness that spread from Blackrock naturally dissolved the illusions that had maintained unjust systems of control and exploitation. People who had previously accepted oppression as inevitable began to recognize their own divine nature and to demand treatment that reflected their inherent dignity as conscious beings. The economic structures that had concentrated wealth in the hands of a few while leaving many in poverty began to give way to more equitable arrangements based on recognition of the interconnectedness of all life. The understanding that individual welfare was inseparable from collective well-being led to innovations in commerce and production that served the common good rather than narrow private interests. Artists and craftsmen found their work transformed as they gained access to sources of inspiration that transcended mere personal creativity. Paintings and sculptures began to appear that carried spiritual energy capable of uplifting and healing those who contemplated them, while musicians composed melodies that could induce states of consciousness conducive to direct spiritual experience. The healing arts advanced rapidly as practitioners learned to work with the subtle energies that the cosmic battle had made accessible to human perception. Diseases that had been thought incurable began to respond to treatments that addressed spiritual as well as physical causes, while entirely new therapeutic modalities emerged that work directly with the consciousness of patients to promote healing on all levels simultaneously. Agriculture flourished as farmers learned to cooperate with the natural rhythms and energies that govern plant growth, producing harvests that were not only more abundant, but more nutritious and spiritually vital. The very soil seemed to respond to the presence of cultivators who understood their role as partners in the cosmic process of creation, rather than as exploiters of natural resources. Architecture evolved to reflect the understanding that buildings were not merely functional structures, but sacred spaces that could either support or hinder the spiritual development of their inhabitants. New forms of construction emerged that harmonized with natural energy patterns and created environments conducive to meditation, healing, and conscious growth. educational systems were revolutionized as teachers learned to address the spiritual as well as intellectual needs of their students. The rigid hierarchies that had previously characterized academic institutions gave way to more collaborative approaches that recognized the unique gifts and perspectives that each individual brought to the learning process. The legal systems that had been based primarily on punishment and control began to evolve toward models that emphasized healing and restoration. Crime was increasingly understood as a symptom of spiritual disconnection that could best be addressed through therapeutic interventions that helped offenders remember their connection to the cosmic whole. Military organizations throughout the Alliance began to incorporate the spiritual insights that had proven so effective at Blackrock, transforming from institutions focused primarily on destruction into forces dedicated to protecting and nurturing the conditions necessary for conscious evolution. The warrior's path became understood as a form of spiritual discipline that could lead to the highest levels of enlightenment when practiced with proper understanding and motivation. Religious institutions found themselves challenged to move beyond mere dogma and ritual toward direct experience of the divine realities that their traditions had originally been designed to transmit. Many established churches underwent profound reformation as their leaders recognized the need to adapt their teachings to the new level of spiritual awareness that was emerging throughout society. The boundaries between different religious traditions began to blur as practitioners discovered that all authentic spiritual paths led ultimately toward the same cosmic source that had been revealed at Blackrock. Interfaith dialogue flourished as representatives of various traditions found common ground in their shared recognition of the fundamental unity that underlay all apparent diversity. Science and spirituality, which had been artificially separated for centuries, began to reunite as researchers discovered that consciousness was not merely an epiphenomenon of material processes, but a fundamental feature of reality that could be studied and understood through appropriate methodologies. New fields of investigation emerged that bridged the gap between empirical observation and mystical experience. The natural sciences advanced rapidly as investigators learned to take consciousness into account when studying natural phenomena. Biology, physics, and chemistry were revolutionized by the recognition that mind and matter were different aspects of a single cosmic reality that could not be fully understood when studied in isolation from each other. Mathematics evolved to include non-quantitative forms of logic that could describe relationships and patterns that existed beyond the reach of numerical analysis. Geometry expanded to encompass the study of multidimensional spaces that existed primarily in consciousness rather than in physical extension. Philosophy underwent a renaissance as thinkers gained access to direct experience of the metaphysical realities that had previously been matters of mere speculation. The great questions that had puzzled humanity for millennia began to find answers through the integration of rational analysis with mystical insight. Literature and poetry flourished as writers discovered that language itself could serve as a vehicle for transmitting spiritual energy. Words became more than mere symbols, evolving into living entities capable of awakening dormant potentials in readers who approach them with appropriate receptivity. The performing arts were transformed as dancers, actors, and musicians learned to channel cosmic forces through their creative expression. Theatrical performances became occasions for collective spiritual experience, while concerts and recitals served as forms of group meditation that could elevate entire audiences to higher states of consciousness. Yet, throughout all these transformations, the essential humility that had characterized the original experience at Blackrock remained as the guiding principle that prevented the awakened consciousness from degenerating into spiritual pride or elitism. Those who had been most deeply touched by the cosmic forces remained the most aware of their dependence on divine grace and their responsibility to serve others rather than themselves. The mountain itself became a teacher whose lessons were available to any who approached with sincere hearts and open minds. The stones held memories of the cosmic battle that could be accessed through meditation, while the streams carried healing energies that could purify consciousness as well as bodies. Pilgrims who came seeking miraculous cures or dramatic spiritual experiences often found instead the gentle invitation to undertake the patient work of inner transformation that was the true path to lasting enlightenment. The mountain did not offer shortcuts or easy solutions, but rather the opportunity to participate in the gradual process of conscious evolution that was the deepest purpose of existence itself. Seasons came and went, marking the passage of earthly time, while the eternal truths revealed at Blackrock continued to unfold their implications throughout the expanding network of awakened consciousness. Each winter brought opportunities for deep reflection and integration, while each spring heralded new developments and applications of the cosmic principles that had been accessed during the battle. The cycles of nature became texts to be read by those who had learned to perceive the spiritual significance that lay hidden beneath surface appearances. The changing of the leaves spoke of transformation and renewal, while the migration of birds carried messages about the importance of following inner guidance even when it led toward unknown destinations. The soldiers who had participated in the cosmic battle aged in their bodies while growing ever younger in their spirits, as they learned to draw energy from sources that transcended the normal limitations of biological existence. They became living bridges between the worlds, their very presence serving to anchor cosmic energies in the material realm while helping others to recognize their own connection to the infinite source of all existence. Their stories became the foundation for new mythologies that would inspire countless generations to undertake their own journeys toward awakening. But these were not mere fantasies or wish fulfillment narratives. They were accurate accounts of what became possible when ordinary human consciousness aligned itself with the cosmic forces that govern the universe at its deepest levels. The light that had blazed so dramatically during the battle settled into the steady glow of an eternal flame that would never be extinguished as long as conscious beings existed who were willing to tend it through their own dedication to the principles of truth and justice. It became not a memory of past glory, but a living presence that continued to guide and inspire all who opened their hearts to receive its blessing. Years passed like pages turning in a vast cosmic book, each season bringing new understanding and deeper integration of the profound truths that had been revealed during those fateful hours at Blackrock. The soldiers who had participated in the cosmic battle became elders and teachers, their very presence serving to awaken dormant potentials in younger generations who had never experienced such dramatic divine intervention, but who carried within themselves the same capacity for spiritual transformation. The children who grew up in the communities that had been established in the shadow of the sacred mountain possessed an innate understanding of cosmic principles that had taken their elders years to develop. These new souls seemed to incarnate with expanded awareness, already in place, as if the spiritual energies released during the battle had prepared the way for more advanced forms of consciousness to manifest in human form. These children played games that would have been recognized as sophisticated spiritual exercises by previous generations, while their casual conversations revealed insights that demonstrated direct access to sources of wisdom that transcended anything that could be learned through ordinary education. They were the first fruits of a new phase of human evolution that had been catalyzed by the cosmic forces accessed at Blackrock. Their teachers found themselves learning as much from their students as they imparted, as the children's natural abilities challenged conventional assumptions about the limitations of human potential. Educational curricula were revolutionized to accommodate learners who could perceive directly what had previously required years of study and contemplation to understand. The arts flourished under the influence of these expanded young consciousnesses as children created works of music, visual art, and literature that carried spiritual energy capable of transforming anyone who experienced them with sufficient openness. Their creations served as bridges between the awakened awareness that was becoming more common and the conventional consciousness that still predominated in much of the world. Healing became a natural ability that manifested spontaneously in many of these young souls, who could see the spiritual causes of physical illness as clearly as their elders perceived the symptoms. Medical practitioners found themselves working in partnership with child healers, whose insights revealed therapeutic approaches that addressed root causes rather than merely alleviating superficial manifestations. The political structures that had governed human societies for millennia began to evolve toward more enlightened forms as these expanded consciousnesses reached maturity and began to assume positions of leadership. They brought to governance an understanding of the interconnectedness of all life that made traditional approaches based on competition and domination seem not just ineffective, but literally inconceivable. Wars between different human factions became impossible as leaders developed the capacity to perceive the cosmic consequences of violent conflict and chose instead to resolve differences through methods that honored the divine nature of all participants. The energy that had previously been devoted to military preparation was redirected toward projects that serve the common good of all humanity. Trade and commerce were transformed by the recognition that economic relationships were opportunities for mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competitions where one party's gain necessarily meant another's loss. New forms of exchange emerged that took into account the spiritual as well as material value of goods and services, creating abundance that benefited everyone involved. Technology developed along paths that harmonized with natural processes rather than attempting to dominate or exploit the environment. Innovations emerged that enhanced human capabilities while supporting the health and vitality of the entire planetary ecosystem. The artificial distinction between natural and manufactured dissolved as inventors learned to work in partnership with the inherent intelligence of matter itself. Agriculture evolved into a form of conscious collaboration with the plant and mineral kingdoms, producing food that nourished souls as well as bodies. Farmers became priests of the earth, their work recognized as sacred service that participated directly in the cosmic process of creation. The abundance that resulted from this cooperation exceeded anything that had been achieved through previous methods based on chemical manipulation and mechanical control. Architecture transcended its previous function as mere shelter to become a means of creating sacred spaces that supported the spiritual development of their inhabitants. Buildings were designed according to principles that took into account the flow of subtle energies, creating environments that naturally promoted healing, creativity, and expanded awareness. Cities were redesigned as organic communities that reflected the understanding of human settlements as living organisms rather than mechanical aggregations of separate parts. Urban planning became a spiritual discipline that sought to create conditions supportive of individual growth within the context of collective harmony. The boundaries between different nations and cultures began to blur as people recognized their fundamental unity despite surface differences in language, custom, and tradition. International relations evolved toward models based on cooperation and mutual support rather than competition and territorial disputes. Communication technologies advanced to include methods for transmitting consciousness as well as information, allowing direct sharing of experience and understanding across any distance. These developments made possible forms of collective decision-making that took into account the perspectives of all affected parties, regardless of their geographical location. Educational institutions evolved into centers for consciousness development where students learned to access cosmic sources of knowledge directly rather than relying solely on information that had been accumulated by previous generations. Learning became a process of remembering what the soul already knew rather than acquiring facts from external sources. Scientific investigation expanded to include consciousness as a fundamental factor in all phenomena, leading to discoveries that revolutionized understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. Researchers learned to work with the living intelligence inherent in natural processes rather than treating the universe as a collection of inanimate objects subject to mechanical laws. Medicine developed into a comprehensive healing art that addressed the spiritual and emotional causes of illness as well as their physical manifestations. Practitioners learned to work with the body's own wisdom and the patient's soul purpose, facilitating healing that addressed the deepest levels of causation rather than merely suppressing symptoms. Religious traditions experienced renewal as their adherents gained access to direct experience of the divine realities that their scriptures and rituals had been designed to transmit. The gap between exoteric and esoteric teachings dissolved as more people developed the capacity to perceive spiritual truths directly rather than accepting them on faith alone. Philosophy evolved beyond mere intellectual speculation to become a discipline that integrated rational analysis with mystical experience. Thinkers gained access to sources of insight that transcended the limitations of purely logical reasoning, leading to new understandings that synthesized ancient wisdom with contemporary knowledge. The performing arts became vehicles for collective spiritual experience, with concerts and theatrical productions serving as occasions for group meditation and consciousness expansion. Audiences participated actively in the creative process, their awareness contributing to manifestations of beauty and meaning that exceeded what any individual artist could have achieved alone. Literature evolved to include forms of expression that worked directly with consciousness, rather than merely conveying information through symbolic representation. Readers found themselves transformed by contact with texts that carried living spiritual energy, their understanding expanding through engagement with words that served as keys to unlock dormant potentials. The natural world responded to the presence of awakened human consciousness by manifesting increased beauty and vitality. Ecosystems that had been damaged by previous exploitation began to regenerate spontaneously, while new species emerged that seemed designed to serve as bridges between different levels of biological organization. Weather patterns stabilized as the planetary consciousness responded to the presence of humans who understood their role as conscious participants in the Earth's evolutionary process, rather than external manipulators seeking to control natural forces for narrow purposes. Climate became a collaborative creation involving all life forms, rather than a mechanical system subject only to physical laws. The mineral kingdom revealed previously hidden properties as human consciousness learned to communicate with the intelligence inherent in crystalline structures and metallic compounds. New materials emerged through this partnership that possessed capabilities far exceeding anything that could be produced through conventional chemistry or physics. The boundaries between different kingdoms of life became permeable as consciousness learned to work directly with the essential patterns that underlay all biological forms. Healing and regeneration accelerated dramatically as practitioners gained access to the templates of perfect health that existed at the deepest levels of organic structure. Time itself seemed to become more fluid as human awareness expanded to encompass multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. Past, present, and future began to be experienced as different aspects of a single eternal moment that could be accessed from any point within the flow of sequential events. Space revealed previously hidden dimensions as consciousness learned to navigate realms that existed beyond the three-dimensional framework that had previously limited human perception. Travel became possible through direct translation of awareness rather than mechanical movement of physical form through resistant media. The cosmic forces that had been accessed so dramatically at Blackrock became available through subtler means as human consciousness evolved to maintain constant contact with divine sources, rather than requiring dramatic interventions to establish connection. Miracles became natural expressions of expanded awareness rather than supernatural exceptions to normal operation. Death was revealed to be merely another form of transformation rather than the termination of existence, as consciousness learned to maintain continuity across transitions between different modes of being. The fear that had previously surrounded mortality dissolved as people gained direct experience of the eternal nature of their essential identity. Birth became recognized as the conscious choice of advanced souls to participate in the ongoing evolution of human potential rather than the random biological accident it had previously appeared to be. Children were welcomed as teachers who brought new understanding from other realms of existence rather than blank slates, requiring complete cultural programming. The family structure evolved to encompass biological and spiritual relationships that transcended conventional genetic boundaries. Communities of choice replaced traditional clan arrangements as people learned to recognize soul connections that went beyond surface genetic similarities. Love expanded beyond personal attachment to encompass universal compassion that included all forms of life without distinction or preference. Relationships became opportunities for mutual spiritual development rather than arrangements designed primarily for emotional security or material advantage. Beauty was revealed to be not merely subjective aesthetic preference, but an objective feature of reality that became visible when consciousness achieved sufficient purity and expansion. Art became a means of making this cosmic beauty accessible to others, rather than simply expressing individual creativity. Truth ceased to be a matter of opinion or cultural convention and became recognized as the direct perception of reality that became available when consciousness was freed from the distortions created by fear and desire. Knowledge became a living relationship with the object of understanding rather than the accumulation of facts about external phenomena. Justice evolved from external enforcement of arbitrary rules toward the natural expression of cosmic harmony that manifested automatically when all parties involved operated from their highest understanding. Law became unnecessary as people learned to govern themselves according to principles that serve the welfare of all life. Freedom was revealed to be not the absence of limitations, but the conscious alignment with cosmic purposes that transcended personal preference and cultural conditioning. Liberation came through surrender to higher will rather than through assertion of individual desires against external obstacles. Peace ceased to be merely the absence of conflict and became the positive presence of harmony that emerged when all participants in any situation operated from awareness of their fundamental unity despite surface differences. Conflict resolution became a process of remembering shared identity rather than negotiating between competing interests. Power was understood to flow from connection with cosmic sources rather than from control over external resources or other people. Authority came to be based on wisdom and service rather than on force or political manipulation. Leadership became a form of spiritual guidance rather than administrative control. Wisdom emerged as the integration of knowledge with love, understanding that transcended mere intellectual comprehension to encompass the direct perception of cosmic patterns and purposes. Intelligence evolved beyond calculation and analysis to include intuitive access to the living truth that animated all phenomena. Joy became the natural expression of consciousness that had remembered its connection to the source of all existence rather than a temporary emotional state dependent on favorable external circumstances. Happiness transformed from something that had to be pursued and achieved into something that was spontaneously present when artificial barriers to natural fulfillment were removed. The mountain that had witnessed the cosmic battle stood as an eternal monument to these transformations, its peaks continuing to catch and reflect the light of distant stars while serving as anchors for the spiritual energies that had been released during those fateful hours. Pilgrims continued to come from all corners of the world, drawn by the promise of direct encounter with the divine forces that had reshaped human possibility. But now they found not just a place of dramatic revelation, but a gentle presence that invited them to discover within themselves the same cosmic consciousness that had been accessed so spectacularly by the original participants in the battle. The mountain had become a teacher whose lessons were available to all who approached with sincere hearts and willingness to undertake the patient work of inner transformation. The light that had blazed so dramatically during the cosmic confrontation now burned with steady warmth in countless hearts throughout the world, a network of awakened consciousness that would continue to expand until every sentient being had been touched by its transforming presence. The victory at Blackrock had established principles and possibilities that would guide human evolution for generations to come, ensuring that the path toward cosmic consciousness would remain open for all who chose to walk it. The scene fades slowly into the eternal light that burns forever in hearts touched by divine love, carrying the listener gently toward dreams where consciousness and cosmos dance in perfect harmony, where every thought becomes a prayer and every breath a blessing, and where the ancient promise of ultimate reunion with the source of all existence echoes through dimensions of peace that have no beginning and no end. And so the tale of Blackrock's cosmic victory passes into legend, but the light that was kindled there burns on forever in the hearts of all who dare to remember that they are more than mortal flesh, more than temporary thoughts, more than passing dreams. They are eternal sparks of the divine flame that created all worlds and will outlast the death of stars, children of the light who have come home to themselves at last. In the silence that follows all words, in the peace that transcends all understanding, in the love that embraces all existence without condition or limit, the mountain keeps its eternal watch, and the light burns on forever and always, world without end, eternal and unchanging in its perfect love. And in that light, all souls find their home, their purpose, their eternal rest in the heart of the divine cosmic consciousness that unites all things in perfect, everlasting harmony and peace beyond all earthly measure or understanding, where the weary find rest and the seekers find truth eternal, and where love conquers all in the end of all stories, bringing peace to every heart and light to every soul that seeks the eternal way home to the source of all love and light and life itself, where all journeys end and all dreams come true in the embrace of infinite compassion and eternal love without end, forever and always. Amen. End of Episode 3. Total length, approximately 101,000 plus characters. Sleep notes. The narrative voice should flow like an eternal river of peace, with extremely long meditative pauses between sections. Each word should be spoken with reverent slowness, allowing the cosmic themes of transformation, consciousness evolution, and eternal light to penetrate deeply into the listener's being, creating a profoundly transcendent experience that guides toward the most peaceful and spiritually nourishing sleep.